Just this past week, Elon Musk's net worth has reportedly crossed the $1 trillion mark. $1 trillion. That is such a massive amount of money that it's hard for most of us to even wrap our heads around. At the same time, reports suggest that SpaceX, one of the companies that is largely responsible for this wealth that he's accrued, has paid little to no federal income tax in the last few years. Now compare that to the reality that most Americans face. Millions of people work full-time jobs every day and still struggle to afford things like healthcare, childcare, house care, or healthcare, or even a place to live. They're doing everything they're supposed to do, working hard, paying their bills, and contributing to society, and yet many are still barely getting by. This highlights a much bigger issue. Over the last few decades, economic inequality in the United States has grown significantly. More and more wealth is being concentrated in the hands of a small number of individuals and corporations, while many working class families, they continue to face this financial stress. That's why I believe the wealthiest Americans and the largest corporations should contribute more in taxes. The revenue generated that could be used to strengthen programs that help struggling families, create more opportunities for people to get ahead. Think about it. A single mother who has to work 2 jobs just to cover everyday expenses between gas, childcare, groceries, and rising rents. Nearly every dollar she earns is already spoken for. Even after working 70 or so hours a week, she may still need public assistance to make ends meet. And her story isn't unique. This really reflects the reality that's faced by millions of Americans every day. And that brings me to what I believe should be done. Well, I believe the United States should increase taxes on extreme wealth and large corporations, because growing economic inequality is hurting millions of Americans. Right now, many important social programs don't have the funding that's necessary. And these targeted tax reforms could help provide the resources that's necessary to strengthen these programs, improve people's quality of life, and even create more opportunities for economic mobility. So what exactly is my point? Well, first of all, growing economic inequality and these underfunded social programs, they create these serious problems, and raising the wealth and corporate taxes is extremely practical and an effective policy solution. And then expanding the social welfare programs would benefit individuals, families, and even society as a whole. Now that we talked about the problems of economic inequality, the question becomes, what should we do about it? First, it's important to understand just how severe the problem has become. Wealth inequality in the United States has reached levels that have never been seen before. According to recent data, the wealthiest 1% of households now own nearly 1/3 of all wealth in the country. Together, that top 1% controls about $55 trillion in assets. That's roughly the same amount of wealth as the bottom 90% of Americans combined. At the same time, billionaire wealth has continued to grow at an extremely extraordinary pace, increasing much faster in recent years than it did in recent years. While wealth accumulates at the very top, millions of Americans continue to struggle financially. The US Census data has reported that nearly 36 million Americans were living below the poverty line in 2024. And many people who are not officially counted as poor are still living paycheck to paycheck, one emergency away from financial disaster. At the same time, we have seen significant cuts to programs such as SNAP and Medicaid, these programs that many working families rely on during difficult times. Adding to this problem, is the fact that many large corporations, they actually benefit from these public roads, schools, emergency services, and infrastructure that's funded by taxpayers. But yet, these highly profitable corporations have paid little to no federal income tax in recent years. And when this happens, the government loses revenue that could be otherwise invested back into the public. So what can we do about this? Well, a practical solution would obviously be to raise wealth and corporate taxes in a targeted way. This would include establishing a federal tax on extreme wealth above a certain threshold, increasing corporate taxes on the largest and the most profitable corporations, and most importantly, enclosing tax loopholes that allow wealthy individuals and businesses to avoid paying what they owe. Strengthening enforcement against these offshore tax shelters would also ensure that the tax code is applied fairly. Once that revenue is generated, it could be invested back into programs that directly improve people's lives. Funding could support healthcare, childcare, education, affordable housing, anti-poverty initiatives, and other essential services. Many other developed countries, they already invest heavily in these areas. And considering that the United States is one of the most wealthiest countries in the world, we certainly have the resources that's necessary to do this stuff. Contrary to what people think, implementing these reforms would not be overly complicated. The IRS already collects much of the financial information that's needed to enforce these tax laws. Providing the agency with these adequate resources would make this implementation much more effective. Most importantly, these taxes would be targeted towards the extremely wealthy and these largest corporations, not working class people or middle class people, or even upper middle class people. If these reforms were put into place, the benefits could be substantial. For example, we could expand educational opportunities by increasing access to early childhood education, improving public schools, and making higher education more affordable. A better educated workforce would strengthen the economy and increase productivity. We could also reduce poverty and economic insecurity. These stronger social safety nets would help families weather these economic downturns, these layoffs, or any other unexpected hardships. Children born into low economic homes would have more opportunities to break these economic cycles, these bad economic cycles. Society as a whole could become healthier, more stable. Communities with low poverty rates often experience lower poverty rates, and better health outcomes and stronger economic growth over time. These investments in people, they don't just help individuals, they strengthen society and our nation as a whole. Now some people do oppose these ideas. A common argument I hear is that higher taxes discourage economic investment and prevent economic growth. However, history shows that periods with higher tax rates coincides with strong economic expansions. In addition, investments in education, healthcare, and infrastructure can make the economy more productive in the long run. When we look at all the evidence, it becomes clear that targeted tax reforms could help address growing economic inequality and create opportunities for millions of Americans. This won't solve every problem overnight, but they would be a meaningful step towards building a more fair and prosperous society. To conclude, economic inequality and underfunded social programs are major challenges faced in our country today. Raising this wealth in corporate taxes offers a practical solution to address these challenges while investing in programs that improve lives. By expanding these education opportunities, reduce poverty, and strengthen communities. These reforms could help create a better future for millions of Americans. And I'll leave you with this question. If you had the resources to ease the burden that millions of people face every day, and doing so would have little impact on your own quality of life, wouldn't you choose to do so? Thank you.